Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today's video, the waiver wire for week 1 of the fantasy playoffs and week 15 of the season. A very important week. You know, we're trimming down the people watching the videos right now. We're noticing that, but I know it's the guys who are in the playoffs, who are still playing fantasy football as hard as they can, looking to win a fantasy championship. So tomorrow's video, Tuesday's video, we'll have some playoff strategy that you guys need to pay attention to. But some of these strategies I'll kind of give away in the waiver wire because it plays a big part in the fantasy playoffs. But I've got a player at least one player at every position for you to add this week to help you win that fantasy championship and help you potentially take down your opponent in week 1 of the fantasy playoffs. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel as well if you enjoyed. Comment down below with any players you're considering to drop. That's a big part of the strategy that we'll talk about tomorrow as well. And Betfred. If you haven't signed up at Betfred, it's getting late in the season. The playoffs, you're not gonna have fantasy football in a few weeks. You're just gonna be able to bet on these games. Love betting on games in the playoffs and love placing a wager on who I think is going to win the Super Bowl. That's always fun for the playoffs as well. If you sign up at Betfred, bet 50, get $250 in free bets. Go sign up. That link is down below in the description. Ohio, coming soon to you guys in the Buckeye State. So go check that out tonight. I love the Patriots. Just if you want to take a -2, you could. 2.5. Patriots on the money line, though, and Hunter Henry over 30.5 receiving yards or over 29.5 receiving yards. If you same game parlay that at Betfred, it's plus 230. Love that. The Cardinals allow the most receiving yards to tight ends this season, over 70 per game to the tight end position. Love Hunter Henry. All right, let's get to the must-add players, starting at the running back position, and Jordan Mason is the first one we'll talk about. If in this time of the year you want to get rid of the guys that are the secondary options, players who aren't playing well, who basically are you couldn't see yourself playing them in a fantasy playoff matchup, and you prioritize the bench with high priority, high value handcuffs. And that's what Jordan Mason is. He's a premier handcuff right now. We're seeing 2 of the final 3 games of for the fantasy playoffs against Seattle and Las Vegas, both bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed to running backs. The injury to Deebo Samuel as well opens up and removes yet another change of pace option. We've seen Mason, who's in his appearances, has averaged 5.3 yards per carry, 8 for 51, and then this week 11 for 56 the last 2 weeks. So I definitely love adding Jordan Mason. And honestly, dropping players like Brandon Cooks, Alan Lazard, the reason I'm not adding DJ Chark is because I don't think I can ever actually play him in any of my fantasy matchups for the rest of the season. So those kinds of guys are guys I would either drop or avoid adding, and instead adding Jordan Mason at 15% rostered. Second running back, staying on the same kind of page here because the running backs are pretty bleak this week. There's not really a lot to go with. Even an injury with the Texans, maybe you could add a Derek Gumbawale or Rex Burkhead. There's not a lot here from the running back position to really add or prioritize adding. Deion Jackson, 6% rostered. All we're looking to do here is stay one step ahead of our opponents. There are a few teams that you want to target for fantasy running backs, being the Browns, the Chargers, the Texans. Those teams have been terrible. The Seahawks as well have been terrible against the run and terrible against fantasy running backs. The Saints and Titans are 2 teams going up against, I believe, the Saints have the Seahawks and the Titans have the Chargers. But the thing is, for me, those 2 teams are dealing with question marks at the backup spot because we saw Mark Ingram out for the year and Dontrell Hilliard dealing with an injury. Let's stay one step ahead here. Deion Jackson has the Chargers not this week, the week following. And they close the season as well with the Giants, who are 24th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So if anything happens to Taylor, which we've seen happen twice this year where he's missed time, we know Jackson's going to be the number 1 guy, not just from the perspective of the number 1 rusher, but he actually has the all-encompassing role of getting targets and receptions as well. He had a 10-reception game in the first game he made and replaced Jonathan Taylor. So in those games that he's missed, Jackson averaged 17.7 touches per game. So we know Jackson's role. We know he's a high-value handcuff in the case that he comes into the number 1 role and an injury happens to Jonathan Taylor. That's what needs to be on your bench. So if you got that spot where you've got someone that you've never been playing, pick up Deion Jackson, add him in case anything happens to Jonathan Taylor this coming week against, I can't remember who they have, tougher matchup, but I would definitely look to add Deion Jackson. Okay, moving to wide receiver. I have 3 guys here, starting with Nico Collins. Collins is 25% rostered. He goes hand in hand with Chris Moore coming off a big week. Same goes for like Philip Dorsett as a potential add as well, but Dorsett didn't have the type of week Moore had, posting over 100 receiving yards. Collins is dealing with a foot injury. He didn't practice all last week. So there's the potential that he does potentially not play this week. And in that case, I do think Moore is a good add. Nobody has a better fantasy playoff schedule than the Houston Texans if you're a wide receiver. Kansas City, 30th. Tennessee, 32nd. Jacksonville, 26th in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And Collins, before last week, in the last 4 weeks he'd played, he was averaging nearly 9 targets per game. High volume. This team is constantly in passing game scripts. They need to move the ball through the air if they're going to be trailing. They're throwing on over 62% of plays right now. Collins is a big-time add for you and someone that probably could be looked over because he didn't play last week. But again, he's going to be someone I don't want to spend a ton of fab on, even though I love the matchups, just because he'd probably be looked over because of the fact he's hurt, and there is the potential that he doesn't play this week either. But definitely want to add him. And if anything happens as well, I do think Chris Moore is a nice cheap add too, in the case that he gets to play in his absence. If you're in a deep league, Moore is probably a high priority add in my mind. Elijah Moore, 27% rostered. It only gets better for this guy. Yet another week of really high route participation. He ran a route on 47 of 51 dropbacks between Mike White and Joe Flacco. That's 92.2% route participation. Very high level here. He also led the team in targets last week with 9. Corey Davis leaves with a concussion. That opens up opportunity for Moore to earn a higher target share, especially with the matchup coming up this week against the Detroit Lions. Detroit is 27th in fantasy points allowed to the position, but an important one of the other videos you might be watching or other people that are looking to give you advice about fantasy wide receivers to add this week might not even know the Lions are dead last in fantasy points allowed to slot wide receivers, 20.8 per game. Far and away the worst. The next closest is at like 17 fantasy points per game allowed to slot wide receivers. This is a guy that has the chance to return immediate value and you could potentially play this week over some other options, which we'll get to later in the week when we do our fantasy wide receiver start sit video. We go through every matchup. So stay tuned for that and really how I feel about him in comparison. But man, plus matchup for this wide receiver core. And the Jets are a major theme in this video, I will say. But only Tampa Bay and Los Angeles over the last 3 weeks are attempting more passes per game right now. The Jets have turned into a very high volume passing offense. In those numbers I mentioned the last 3 weeks, Tampa, 50.7 pass attempts per game. Los Angeles, 48.3. The Jets, 44.7. The next closest, Detroit at 39. These 3 teams are far and away. The Jets are throwing the ball at a very high rate. So we want to get pieces of this offense because volume is king in fantasy football. And this is a guy that's in for some major volume because Denzel Mims is going to replace Corey Davis. Davis with that concussion, I don't expect him to play this week. And Mims does not demand target share, does not demand volume. So expect Elijah Moore to be a massive beneficiary out of the slot for this Jets team. Last wide receiver, definitely a deep play. Trent Taylor, 0% rostered. Tyler Boyd, a dislocated finger. It looks like from reports he's going to miss at least a week, maybe 2. And Higgins, apparently he could have played last week. For any of you guys that started him and lost, if you started him and it was reliant on you making the fantasy playoffs, you're probably not watching the video, but prayers up to you because that's tough. But apparently he could have played this past week, but they didn't want to push it. So we saw Trent Irwin on the outside replacing him, but Irwin is the outside replacement and Trent Taylor is the slot replacement. If you look at the way where Taylor has been when he's been on the field this season, 75 routes in the slot, just 12 outside. And it's been a similar discrepancy for Irwin too. So I expect Higgins to probably be back and Boyd to miss. So that gives value to Taylor as opposed to Irwin. I know Irwin had the touchdown, found the end zone, but he actually doubled Irwin in targets on the day. It was just the fact that Irwin found the end zone. So I do think Taylor is the better add. Tampa Bay up next week. They're 14th in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, or I shouldn't say next week, this week. And they're 21st in fantasy points allowed to slot receivers. So some decent value for Taylor on a Bengals offense. Even though the Bucs, I don't think their run defense is as good as people make it out to be. The Bengals typically struggle mightily in throwing the ball or in running the ball against really anybody. So a plus matchup or a matchup where they could be running the ball or throwing the ball quite a bit. And the Bucs don't really have a pass rush either. So this could be a good advantageous spot for their pass game too. All right, tight end. I got 2 tight ends for you guys, starting with Tyler Conklin, 25% rostered. Conklin, another beneficiary of the Davis absence. I think it's going to give him a major boon. We saw this past week he had, I think, 5 receptions, 7 targets. Gave us you a kind of a decent game if you're in PPR, very serviceable for the tight end position. That's what we're looking for here. He's 5th in routes run on the season, 8th in targets. And like I mentioned about Moore, this is a very plus matchup. Detroit is actually 29th in fantasy points allowed to tight ends and allow the 2nd most touchdowns per game to tight ends. So a very good matchup. Conklin will probably be out there for a lot more routes than he already is because of the Davis absence. He's a better playmaker and a better player, I think, than Denzel Mims. So expect to see Conklin on the field, maybe a little bit more in the slot, and Moore could even move out wide a decent amount more. Moore's been like a 65-35. We could see like a 50-50 split potentially, and Conklin could run some more routes from the slot too. So gives him some value. I think he's the guy from the wire right now that I would add and then be willing to play. The other one here that I have that's more of a stash, we talked about Greg Dulcich being the guy to hang on to and add last week to be able to play him this coming week against the Cards. Or are they against the Seahawks? No, they're against the Cards. But this week, for me, the guy to add and just kind of tuck away is K. Dotton, 9% rostered. Again, looking ahead of the tight end position, we got to do that if we're in a tough spot at that spot. And Otten goes against the Cardinals in week 16. Mentioned it with Henry for this week's matchup. League worst, 73.3 yards per game to tight ends and 31st in fantasy points allowed. So Otten makes sense to be a deeper add that you can stash away. And he, this past week against the 49ers, he did outsnap Cam Brate. I know the two of them are kind of splitting work a little bit, but Otten seems to be the guy they trust a little bit more and are running out there a little bit more. And in a high volume passing offense with a team that can't run the ball, this is a guy you want to add on the off chance that he kind of this next week is one to pay attention to, that he really takes over as that number 1 guy for this offense too. Last one, Mike White at the quarterback spot, 20% rostered. Like, Mike White is a guy I want to play. I know the rib injury is a concern, right? Like it looks like from what Robert Salah said, it does look like he's going to be available and expected to play this week against Detroit. And again, I'm just keep picking on Detroit here, but in fantasy playoffs, I'm playing on matchup. Like, I have this data, this information. Why don't I use it to my advantage? Detroit is allowing the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, 25.5 fantasy points per game to QBs. And Mike White has posted, you look at another kind of cupcake matchup, the Bears 3 weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, he threw for 315 yards and 3 touchdowns, gave you a massive, massive week. Obviously, not a lot of us were probably playing him, but let's do it now. Like, this guy's averaging over 300 passing yards per game since he's stepped in as the starter, 3 weeks ago? And I'd play him over a number of guys this week. You look at Kirk Cousins against the Colts, Desmond Ridder. Like, if you're going to risk your season in the fantasy playoffs and Desmond Ridder, I'd have some major questions for you, unless you're in like a super flex league and I don't know what would have to happen. Maybe you've got a couple of these guys I'm mentioning, but I'd play him over Ridder. I'd play him over Jared Goff. Like, the Jets are an elite pass defense. I'd play him over Goff. And then I'd play him over Derek Carr against the Patriots pass defense as well. So I think Mike White, for some of you, you might feel like you need to go to this guy over what you have right now, and I wouldn't blame you. Like, this is worth the risk. This is a ton of information here we have on the Lions and defensively against quarterbacks that we can take advantage of. So I definitely look to play Mike White. I know it's a risky proposition in the first week of the fantasy playoffs. I think it's one worth taking advantage of. So Mike White is my favorite ad here off the wire that's less than 50% rostered at the quarterback position. All right, every position covered on the waiver wire. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know. And thank you guys so much for getting us to 20,000 subscribers on YouTube. Really appreciate it. All the love all season. We're getting into the stretch run. Hopefully we can help you win a fantasy championship. Drop a like, subscribe if you enjoyed. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.